we're going to be delving deep into an amazing interview with Sean McGirr in Vogue Business. So that will be a very long one. So to jump straight into it, first we'll be starting with talking about this article that I've read from Vogue Business. And I actually thought the article was so good that I have to reread it to you guys and kind of react to it in real time and talk about what I think about everything that was being said. Now, Sean McGirr, for those of you that aren't aware, is the current creative director of Alexander McQueen. Of course, he took over from Sarah Burton, who of course was a long-time standing member of the McQueen family, having worked under Lee McQueen himself. So Sean McGirr then became the first disconnect from Lee McQueen, where every single creative director that has been there, not that there have been many, has had some personal connection to Lee McQueen. Of course, his first show at McQueen, people didn't take to it well. People didn't really like it. People thought that he didn't really translate McQueen's ideas in an interesting way. However, I personally think that since then he has done really well. And I think that he has, had some really interesting ideas and done some really interesting stuff. He's had 2 runway shows and a few other of those like pre-fall collection type things, resort collections. So yeah, let's get straight into the article and kind of see what was said and what he was saying, essentially. So this article is titled, How Sean McGirr is Making His Mark at McQueen. Now, already, when I was reading this initially, I thought, that's a bit premature. McGirr has been there for a year. You can't really make your mark at a brand like that in just a year, considering how the first show went as well. I think, of course, I know that journalists have to editorialize in that sense, but I think it's a bit OT to say that, he's making his mark at McQueen. So I thought that was a bit crazy, to be honest. But what it then says is, Alexander McQueen's legacy is a complicated one to manage. Meet the designer taking on the house's heritage and making it his own. And there's some interesting points that they put actually in this article that I thought was really interesting. So some parts of the article I'll skip, but I'll kind of summarize and tell you what is said. So the first part of this article, they essentially talk about the fact that, Sean McGirr was standing outside during when he was about to showcase his Spring Summer 25 collection, the McQueen collection that was just across the Seine from the Louvre, talking about, how stressed he was before the collection, talking about how he was showing Francois-Henri Pinault all the details of his designs and all the details of the collection, all the different tuxedos, the lapels, the dresses, the rugby tops, all these kind of things. And they talk about, some stuff that McGirr has gone through, kind of the fact that he was working backstage with the staffers to make sure that everything was in place before the show started. They also talk about some of the inspirations for the collection, which, for those of you who don't know, the Spring Summer 25 collection was heavily inspired by Autumn Winter 1994 by McQueen, the Banshee collection. And I have a lot to say about that actually, because I think the way he translated it was very, very interesting based on what he says. I don't know if I agree with him in some of the ways that he translates McQueen's ideas, but we'll get to that soon. But just kind of like as a background, because we will be talking about Autumn Winter 1994 by McQueen. So Banshee was Lee McQueen's, sometimes I always wonder, should I call him Lee McQueen or Alexander McQueen? But Lee is what people actually call him, like his name. So Autumn Winter 1994 was Lee McQueen's second runway show. And the inspiration came from Irish folklore about banshees who were heard to be wailing when a boat sank. Now, it's very interesting because a lot of McQueen's ideas, especially in the early times, I think later on in McQueen's career, this kind of slowed down where things were a bit more wholesome and it wasn't so dark and terrifying and scary and disgusting and vulgar. I think a lot of the early McQueen collections kind of took inspiration from ideas that tended to be very vulgar. I remember in this collection, something that was really shocking was there was a pregnant woman who was wearing like an Elizabethan style gown. And everyone was like, oh my God. Because back then you need to remember that fashion was very classical and very like mainstream fashion. I'm not talking about all of fashion because of course you had the likes of Rei Kawakubo and what she was doing, and there were other designers that were breaking barriers in that sense. But for the most part, people weren't really used to designers doing these kind of things. And there's always like a gasp, like, oh my God. And it's funny because McQueen literally says himself that, you know, he wants people to be shocked when they go to his runway shows. He wants people to be sick. He wants people to vomit. He wants people to throw up when they go to shows. He wants people to leave horrified and petrified. That is literally what he wanted. So I guess he was really successful in that. But why I find Seán McGirr really interesting is because Seán McGirr always talks about this idea of really enjoying this side of McQueen. But I don't know in what sense he enjoys it, because I don't get any of that sensibility from Seán McGirr's work at all. There's absolutely nothing shocking or horrific or scary or terrifying about any of Seán McGirr's work. And considering that he said, yeah, I really love what McQueen was able to channel with doing that, I just don't see that in his work. So that's something that really confuses me, considering how many times he keeps referencing, I want to have this animalic youth idea of what McQueen is. That's his vision of McQueen. I don't see anything really animalic in, you know, his McQueen. I don't even know what he means by animalic, because I just don't see it. So I really don't see it. But anyway, that is one of the big inspirations from this collection. They talk about, you know, Salma Hayek, who of course is the wife to Pinol, and the paparazzi going around. It was very funny in one section in the article, they were talking about how Seán McGirr is one of those Fashion Week smokers. He's frantically smoking because of the stress of Fashion Week. That's a very fashion thing. You have more cigarettes than you have sleep. More hours of sleep. It's quite sad, actually, that fashion forces that out of everyone. Then he talks about, you know, coming in really early in the morning, having to break everything down and building it back up, you know, all the different things that they were doing to try and put things together. They talk about what he was wearing, which is very interesting. They said, today he's dressed in a tie-dyed McQueen t-shirt with an upside-down skull embroidered dead in the middle of the chest with skinny jeans and sneakers. But what I found really interesting is what was said after. So he said, I've been busy wearing a lot of McQueen, he says. It's important to see how the fit is and to improve things as well. Sometimes things don't turn out how you thought. Which is interesting, because we have this conversation all the time about designers wearing their work. And I actually do enjoy, and I'm very happy that he takes pride in wearing a lot of his work to kind of see what it's like wearing it day to day and kind of test it in the real world and see what works, see what doesn't, see how the body interacts, you know, see how the body moves with these garments. I actually really enjoy that. I think that most designers should do that. I find it really strange when designers don't really have a way of testing out their garments in the real world. They kind of just design it and then it's on to the next. I don't really understand that. So I'm very happy that he's wearing a lot of McQueen stuff, seeing what works, seeing that, okay, now that I'm wearing this, I can see that this idea might not really work. So, but it's good for me to wear it so I can understand that. I like that. I really, really enjoy that. Then he talks about, you know, making sure that every last T-bar detail worked as intended. Now, this T-bar detail is something that he is, you know, starting to make a staple of his McQueen. When you look at all the McQueen shows, you look at all his things, even on the belts, you see the T-bar reference. You see it in a lot of the footwear. Even in the footwear from this collection, you see it. So even the brooches have that. So you just see it all over in all the details. And he referenced Louise Wilson in terms of perfecting this T-bar detail, saying that Louise Wilson was, you know, one of those tutors at Central St. Martin's that would always say, no, it's not right. It's not right. You know, you have to get things perfect, and kind of this idea that you have to keep on going and keep on shifting things and changing things slightly until it becomes perfect. So I like that he's coming from that perspective of a perfectionist. Also, really, really big fan of that so far. So now in this section of, and we'll get to the part where I'll read it, but this isn't the section yet. But in this section, they really just talk about kind of the background of how he ended up in McQueen. The fact that in 2023, Kering announced that Sarah Burton would step away from McQueen, and many wondered who the next designer would be, where the brand would go, what direction would they take? Would they go really commercial? Would they try to channel some more of McQueen's ideas? What exactly would they do? What would they do? Then they talk about some context as to kind of where McQueen sits in the market in the current day. And I thought that part was actually really interesting. So it says, February 2025 may mark 15 years since Lee's death, but his emotional hold on the culture at large is ongoing. His Highland rape and the Hunger shows still linger in the minds of Gen X editors as 90s fashion at its most electrifying. Meanwhile, millennials who would struggle to tell a 255 from a Lady Dior waited up to 6 hours in thousand-strong queues to see Savage Beauty at the Metropolitan Museum's Costume Institute. And Gen Z TikTokers are making McQueen's 2003 skull scarves their entire personality. Despite some not yet being born when Karen Elson sashayed down the runway with one tied to her pirate breeches. Of course, Lee McQueen's is a hard story to forget. His contradictions endlessly mythologized. Here was a Savile Row apprentice who used the pattern cutting he'd learnt making English drape suits to invent the infamous bumster trouser, who yearned for extreme reactions to his designs. Oh, they even have the quote that I was talking about. So the quote is, "I'd rather people left my shows and vomited," he once said. "I want heart attacks, I want ambulances." But also launched a range of prom dresses with Target, whose East End origins and Celtic heritage fueled collections that ripped classicism and empire to shreds, yet whose legacy is bound up with British bluebuds like Isabella Blow and Stella Tennant. I also think there's someone really important that they're leaving out, but I think they'll mention her later on. But Daphne Guinness is also someone that needs to be mentioned when you talk about those kind of people. Robert says, wait, this is the same man talking about the animalistic allure of London. Yes, it very much is the same man. Like I said, I don't really see the animalistic side of McQueen. I really struggle with that in terms of Seán McGirr saying that that's what he's trying to channel. Like, he even says it again. We've already gone through this in past reviews of McQueen shows, but he literally says, his idea of McQueen is going to be animalistic youthfulness. I don't see it. I don't see it. I don't see it. I don't see it. I just don't see it. But there are some interesting quotes in this section. He was talking about the fact that he's recently been studying Isabella Blow's 1989 wedding at the Gloucester Cathedral. He also is talking about how Tennant remains his favorite model of all time, and he hopes to restore some of the playful aggression the house had in its infancy. And see, this is what I mean. He hopes to restore some of the playful aggression the house had in its infancy. Right now, I haven't seen it. But to quote him, he says, "There's a sort of intellectual kinkiness, which I quite like. He told me shortly after he landed the job. It's not overtly sexy at all, and I think that's really modern." During his frequent visits to the house's King's Cross archives this year, he bypassed more commercial noughties collections to focus on Lee's earliest drawings. So you see what I mean? He's not looking at some of the more, commercial collections. He's really looking at some of Lee McQueen's earliest work that was the rawest and the most violent. So he says there's this confidence in his line drawing that is like, wow, it's razor sharp, almost architectural. At the same time, McGirr notes, there's also a new generation that couldn't get into McQueen, you know what I mean? While the house under Burton gracefully matured and refined its proposition, McGirr wants his McQueen to be about youthful energy and what he calls the animal within. So yeah, this is exactly what he said. So he said, McGirr wants his McQueen to be about youthful energy and what he calls the animal within. Guys, do we see the animal within through his McQueen? Do we see that? If you are to ask me, I don't see any animal within. I don't see it. I don't see it. I'm struggling. And I've been struggling for a year. None of which is to say that he doesn't have a deep, deep respect for Burton, Lee's right hand from the time of her own degree at St. Martin's, and the way she made the house her own during her 13-year stint as creative director. If Lee claimed to have sticks expletives into the linings of the Prince of Wales Anderson and Shepherd suits and pubic hair into the hats of the Queen's beefeaters, Burton unfurled 9 feet of satin gazelle on the steps of Westminster Abbey as Miss Catherine Middleton married into the House of Windsor in 2011. And this is a strong point, because I think the point that the journalist is trying to make is that Lee McQueen his work was very raw and violent, and it was it channeled a very deep and dark energy. Whereas what Sarah Burton did is she kind of commercialized it, and she also made it more classical looking. And you look at who she was dressing, you look at who McQueen became associated with when Sarah Burton was creative director. They're two very different things that they did at the house, right? And then the journalists used that as a way to kind of transition into what Seán McGirr actually wants, what his actual goal for McQueen is, which I was like, okay, that's interesting. That's interesting. So what he said is, McQueen is all about tensions between attraction and repulsion, refinement and brutality, and yes, the avant-garde and the commercially viable. As Lee himself said, when the press eviscerated him for his debut Givenchy collection, it's fucking hard to be both at the same time. Backstage in Paris, I'm wondering if it's even possible, as the Banshee headpiece is reunited with its dress on a mannequin, when a McQueen publicist in a Motorola headset appears at my elbow. So yeah, it's very interesting that, you know, he kind of wants to play on these tensions between the commercial and the energetic and the dark and the violent and all these kind of things. I don't think he's found that tension, personally. I really don't think he's found that tension yet. But yeah, I'm going to skip this part. This part was interesting, but it's kind of just them talking about like his ideas for the Resort 25 collection, which was interesting, but I'm not that interested in talking about it. This was very interesting, this paragraph where he said, McQueen is so much about the atelier, he insists. And while he's brought in some of his own designers and cutters, much of the team that worked under Burton is still in place, some of them remaining from Lee's days. His aim is to use their technical mastery to bring a frisson of daring back to British fashion. I think of McQueen as a lab for experimentation, for creativity. I say it to my design team, play around, push ideas until they are strong and feel like they go somewhere else. Now, me personally, and this is the thing about me being a journalist, just because designers say stuff doesn't mean it's true. And even if they believe it to their soul, it still doesn't mean it's true. There is nothing that I've seen, and by the way, I just think the first collection I didn't really like, but since then I have been a fan of a lot of stuff that Seán McGirr has done, and we'll talk about Spring Summer 25 after I finish going through this article. But I just don't see this idea of, you know, McQueen as a lab for experimentation and for creativity and, you know, saying that they want to bring daring back to British fashion. Like, in what world is Seán McGirr's McQueen so far bringing daring back into British fashion? Just because it's written in an article doesn't mean it's true. And that's the issue sometimes I have with the way that people talk about their work. It's almost like there's a lack of self-awareness there. There's a big lack of self-awareness. Big lack of self-awareness, you know? But anyway, they talk about how, you know, McGirr actually grew up as a really big fan of McQueen and McQueen's work, which I actually thought was very interesting. And, you know, him talking about him embracing his sexuality and coming out as gay and all these kind of things. Well, we can skip that. They talk about, you know, the scholarship that he got that kept him going financially and through school and kind of what he did with his graduate collection. They're talking about the through line of McGirr's life. Them talking about all the stuff that he's done in the past, where some of his early inspiration was, which actually I think all of it is very, very interesting. I find it really interesting with this article and how detailed it is, because obviously the journalist shadowed McGirr for a very long time. It's sad that this article didn't come out around the time of the Spring Summer 25 collection, because I think there's so much good information there talking about McGirr's ideas in this article, and most people won't read it because it's not coming out at a time when, you know, the buzz of the show leads people to searching about it, which leads people to actually reading the article. Of course, I read everything, so that's different, and I'll always bring stuff to the streams. But I think it's sad that in general, most people won't read this article, because even, you know, when I'm done, because I'm not talking about every single detail in this article, I will say that all of you, if you can, read the article. I'm posting it in the chat right now. But yeah, I think it's really sad because I think there's so much good information about the background of Seán McGirr in general. But anyway, continuing on. Some really interesting things that, you know, I've kind of taken out and written down in my notes that I thought were really interesting is just this idea of, and there's a through line in this article, which is this idea of, you know, wanting to have respect for the House of McQueen, but not wanting to do what Sarah Burton did. And it's almost, from what he says in this article, I get a sense that he's almost insinuating that Sarah Burton's McQueen was too commercial and he kind of wants to take it back to somewhere in between Sarah Burton and Lee McQueen. That is the overall understanding I get from the whole article. And I do think he's tried, in the sense that he's tried to have some, you know, crazy ideas. Remember in the debut show, which we've talked about so many times at this point, you know, the different ideas, whether it's the iPhone screen dress or it's, you know, this idea of car mechanics and stuff like that, or it's this. But my issue is when you look at the direct references for some of the stuff that he's referencing, his version just looks like a very, very way worse version of the actual original reference. The worst case of that being Lana Del Rey's dress at the Met Gala, right? So while he's trying, I can see that he's trying. I just think when it comes to the execution, it leaves a lot to be desired in that sense. If Lee could talk from the grave, be you, stop trying to be me. I wouldn't actually say that Seán McGirr is trying to be McQueen, to be honest. I don't get that sense from the stuff that I've read about him, the interviews I've read, the interviews I've watched. He's trying to be in between Sarah Burton, McQueen. He's trying to meet that balance between being commercial, but also, like he says, he wants his McQueen to be this animalic, youthful idea of McQueen. So anyway, continuing on. So they talk about, his life, kind of how he runs the McQueen studio and the fact that the atmosphere in the McQueen studio is very democratic. He's very open. He allows people to share their thoughts. People have a lot of input on how things go. Talk about some of the tailors that they use in Italy, some of the fabric makers in the north of England, the fact that they have merchandisers in Korea, which was very, very interesting. And a quote that he said that I found interesting was, "I'm not making clothes for a museum. McGirr tells me more than once. It's really important that people wear things. Given the turbulent state of the world lately, he hopes his designs can be a form of modern armor. It's almost like a way of surviving wearing McQueen." Now, once again, the journalist in me is like, there is nothing about any luxury fashion brand that is a way of surviving. Like, I understand this idea of a modern armor in the sense of, something that you feel protected in, something that gives you confidence. I understand that, but a modern armor that's almost like a way of surviving. The choice of words, I just don't understand it. Almost like a way of surviving. You know me, I'm always like on top of anything that people say. I'm always going to overanalyze their words because there is nothing about any luxury brand that's almost like a way of surviving. A way of surviving would be, I live in a very, very cold climate, so I need to wear garments that keep me warm so I can actually survive. That is clothing being worn as a way of surviving, not, luxury garments with loads of sequins and really nice embroidery with really nice tailoring, which is nice. But a way of surviving, I don't know about that choice of words. But anyway, continuing on, they talk about some of the ideas that he has, like a zebra print fabric, the fact that he's abstracted houndstooth, which I've actually talked about in the past from some of his collections so far, talking about the factories and how they're waiting to get started with production, and the concept of the Banshee and how he actually came to that concept, right? But I actually want to read that part because I thought it was really interesting. It said, "If the concept of the Banshee has begun to crystallize in McGirr's mind, there's nothing yet to see in terms of clothes. Just rail after rail of vintage clothes for research, from an olive green leather trench to a cream rayon cape embellished with sequin lightning boots that Ziggy Stardust might have worn. As McGirr will admit to me later on, you need a bit of time to understand who you are within the framework of this kind of brand, which has never really had a new creative director." Which is true. I do agree with him, and I actually do agree with that way of doing things, because once again, he is so far removed from the original idea of what McQueen stands for, because we've only ever seen Sarah Burton and Lee McQueen at the helm of the house, and they were both connected. So Seán McGirr is almost like completely disconnected from that entirely. So he has to really spend a lot of time going through the archives and really, really trying to understand what McQueen stood for, what the McQueen codes are, and then really understand where he fits in within everything and what his own codes that he wants to create for the brand will then be in the future. So I do agree with that way of doing things, actually. So continuing on, he said, "I tried to figure out how much time he's actually had. It's July and it's in the months since McGirr's appointment was announced. He's produced a 52-look autumn collection, attempted to meet the scores and scores of people working underneath him, overseen a 31-look resort offering, started the spring collection, and weathered 2 PR storms." Them saying he weathered 2 PR storms is very, very accurate, to be honest. The internet met the news of his arrival in October 2023 with a tiled monochrome image of McGirr next to Kering's 5 other creative leads: Anthony Vaccarello at Saint Laurent, Demna Balenciaga, Odasano Gucci, Norbert at Brioni, and Matteo Blasi at Bottega Veneta. Now, what the journalist is actually talking about is that image. If you guys don't remember, there was an image that came out. Let me see if I can actually find it, of, one granary. I think it came out on one granary of Kering designers, and they're basically being no woman, and basically every designer at Kering being like a white man, basically a gay white man, and saying that there's an issue with diversity. This is the image on one granary. There was an issue with diversity, and this was his first PR storm, because of course, like, it was a lot of tough things being said about Seán McGirr, about just men in general, And so it's funny that he has weathered 2 PR storms. It's only been a year. The second PR storm, which I'm sure they'll get into in the article, was when he had his first runway show. People did not like it. And my issue with the runway show, actually, the reason I didn't like it was not necessarily because I thought all the clothing was atrocious. I always judge collections in the framework that they exist in, if that makes sense. And I think he said that he wanted to channel this animalic side of McQueen, and this kind of like deep, dark, the gritty side of London. That's what he was channeling. It was in an abandoned train station in Paris. I was literally there in person. I was there in the front row at this McQueen show, actually. It was in an abandoned train station. We were sat on these kind of foam things, which, considering a lot of references, were all these like horsehoof heels and horsetails and things like that, which I'm sure was how he was channeling this animalic understanding of his McQueen. There needs to be a 360 way that you think of the way that you're channeling the shows. Like, even the set was confused. You have a sponge seat in an abandoned train station with industrial lights. There was just absolutely nothing about it that was really animalic. And if he was trying to channel the gritty side of London, I can see that with the abandoned train station. But then the rest of the set has to really reflect that. And so it just seemed very confused. The whole collection seemed like a confusing mess. And it seemed like trying to throw all the ideas, which some of them I thought were interesting. The crack screen idea, the mechanics idea, some of the references he was using. I liked some of the tailoring. I liked a lot of the accessories. But overall, it was a mess. And so that's what I just don't really understand about it. He's certainly being melodramatic, with the notion of luxury being a tool for survival by elite circles is not far-fetched when he acknowledged the use of luxury as a sign value in their hierarchies. I guess so, but these days, if you're using luxury as, sign value in your hierarchy, that's a bit sad, because a lot of these luxury garments aren't even made that well anyway. You're just like flexing because you spent loads of money on plastics. That's a bit of a shame. But anyway, going back to the article, it said, in terms of gender and racial identity, as a social media chorus quickly pointed out, one of these things was very much like the others. McGirr replies thoughtfully and sensitively when I mention it. It's a really important conversation to have, he says, adding that it's always been critical to him to have a team that's super diverse, not just in terms of race and gender, but age and nationality as well. What he doesn't say is that even now, it still takes preternatural grit, talent, and determination to rise from a suburban Dublin community to the head of a Kering house with a reported annual turnover of more than 800 million euros as of 2022. He's working class, says fellow London designer Charles Jeffrey, who's known McGirr since he served as his fit model at St. Martin's. Their friendship solidified over nights dancing at Vogue Fabrics in Dalston. There's not that many of us that have these voices in the industry. And you know what? To go back to that conversation about, the gay white men in the industry, I think it's such a complicated conversation to have, because even within, like, gay white men are not a monolith, right? So even within a group of gay white men heading these brands, they come from so many different circumstances. Like they pointed out, it's very difficult to be a working class man to make it all the way to the top, because there are so many barriers in your way. I've talked about this in fashion so many times, working in fashion, where, when you work in fashion, if you're not from a rich family, you have to get an actual job, even to study fashion design, because you need to buy fabrics, you need to buy all these things that you need money for. And if your parents can't just give you that money, you need to work for it. And the time that other designers can use to just work on the craft of things and to work on the actual skills, you spend making money to survive. Then on top of that, when it comes to the internships, a lot of internships are unpaid in fashion. So if you are a rich kid, you can just go to work and come back and pay for travel, which is really expensive in London, pay for these expensive lunches and these dinners and galas and not even care because you just have money at your disposal. Whereas if you're coming from a working class background, it's not that easy because where do you get money from to be traveling to and from work and to be traveling to all these places and to be buying overpriced lunch because the offices of these fashion brands are in central London where everything is so expensive and all those kind of things. And sometimes there are even bigger barriers where if you aren't rich and you don't live in London, now you have to start commuting from far. You're spending all your time traveling. So you're just at such a natural disadvantage. And so I feel like there needs to be some nuance, even within, it's just white gay men. There needs to be some nuance talking about how difficult it is. Whatever, if you're black, white, whatever, if you're working class, it's close to impossible to go to the top of these brands. And I think it's very commendable that Seán McGirr has gone that far in fashion considering his background. It's really hard. It's so much harder than people think it is. It's so much, the disadvantages are actually insane. And I do think that is a conversation that needs to be had. I also don't agree with, people hiring people just for the sake of ticking boxes because that's how you have really shitty people that can't do the job in your brand and it makes other people in your team do more work, right? I've definitely worked in, not to say that like people were hired because they're a woman or, a certain race or whatever, but I've just worked in a work environment where people can't do their job. And so it makes my job harder because now I have to kind of do their job and do my job as well, which isn't really good on other employees. So I think it's good to hire people that can do the job well. And I think just by naturally doing that, your brand will be diverse. But just kind of going out of your way to be diverse just for the sake of being diverse, I don't think that's beneficial for anyone, to be honest. And as a black person, the last thing I want is to be hired for a job I can't do, and then I do a terrible job, and then people start using that as, see, this is why this doesn't work, and like all that sort of stuff, right? So there's also that. And you also have to remember that it's very hard to hire certain people because it's who has the experience. And this is where being working class, it becomes really difficult to get these jobs as a working class person because you might not have the experience that someone who's rich has because they just have the opportunity to do all these jobs that are unpaid and just have a crazy resume because they just can do those jobs and not get paid. And so by the end of it, their resume just looks better than yours. But people don't consider the factors as to how they got to that resume, considering, they didn't have to pay for out of pocket or work for the money to buy their fabrics through their graduate collection and all these things. So I do think that it's a very important conversation to have, but I think a better conversation needs to be had just then the conversation that, it's just white gay men. Let's have some more nuance in the conversation. Like, what are their backgrounds? Where are they coming from? What are their resumes like? What is the talent pool for these kind of jobs? Like, who can actually do these jobs? Who are other viable options? I think we just really need to have like a better conversation about it. But I do think it's a valid conversation to have, considering that fashion is an industry, which I always say, that is dominated by women in terms of customer base. So it is kind of strange to not see that reflected in the top jobs. It's very odd. But anyway, continuing on in the article. And then there's the response to McGirr's debut, which, as I said, was the second PR craze. Concocted in less than a month and presented in the disused train depot of Les Olympiades on an oddly wintry evening in March. Yeah, that evening was weird. It was raining, it was windy, it was cold. Everyone arrived late, so the show was late. So I always feel like the vibe of the show wasn't good already. Like when I was going to the show, some of the trains on the way got cancelled. There was crazy traffic because it was raining. So everyone was ordering Ubers because you couldn't be outside in that rain because it was heavy. So everyone was ordering Ubers. So there was crazy traffic. Everyone was driving everywhere. The trains were cancelled. So everyone just got there late. It was wet. People's outfits were messed up. People didn't have umbrellas. It was just a whole mess. So I can imagine people already in kind of like a terrible mood. I wasn't, but I can imagine, the typical fashion person. It's like, oh my God, my dress. So they were already in a terrible mood. And that kind of did, I guess, factor in a way to the response to the show. And I think that's kind of their fault too, because the show was so much on the outskirts of Paris, right? It was so far away from the typical places that you have shows in Paris. So I just think that needs to be mentioned. But anyway, continuing on, it says, McGirr had been studying Lee's spring 1995 The Birds collection, particularly its translucent cling film dress, and experimenting with compression and distortion through sculptural knitwear, sharply angular silhouettes, and shoes inspired by horses and goats, which I found the shoes really amazing. I did really love the shoes, by the way. While much of the mixed reaction among the editors and influencers was coolly measured, none of which impacted the virality of McGirr's hoof boots, far too much of the Instagram commentary veered into cyberbullying, cloaked in the guise of fashion criticism. First of all, let's just stop there. No one was bullying Seán McGirr. If people don't like a show, they can defend the fact that they don't like a show. I do know that this is Vogue magazine, and Vogue magazine is very much the magazine where they celebrate every brand. Kering advertises in a lot of Vogue, so they can't really say negative things. You have to bear that in mind when you read a Vogue article, right? I've written for Vogue, and when I wrote for Vogue, I wrote really like critical and interesting writing, and they took out all the negative stuff and took out all the critique, and by the end of it, it just looked like a happy piece without any substance. And it's kind of annoying because then someone would read my writing and think I write that way, but it's not me, it's the editor, right? So Vogue saying that it veered into cyberbullying is complete bullshit. Like, no, designers aren't immune from fucking critique. I don't know why they think that critique is bullying. Like, grow up. I get critiqued every day. People don't agree with my ideas. People are like, you fucking idiot. You are stupid. You don't like this collection because you don't know anything about fashion. And that's fine because that's their opinion. Like, deal with it. This whole thing of you critiqued, a collection and all of a sudden everything is cyberbullying. I just don't. Does that mean you just can't be honest with anyone, or you can't be honest about anything and you can't critique anything because we have to protect people's feelings? Like, you are literally doing one of the most public-facing roles in the world. Like, being a creative director, a massive brand like that is public-facing. If you don't want to deal with that, then you probably shouldn't be a creative director of a massive house like that, where a brand that's covered by press every season, people are watching your every move every season, people are looking at your collections every season, and people have something to say about those collections because people are really passionate about these collections, right? The reason why people have so much to say about McQueen also is because people spend their hard-earned money buying this stuff. The reason why these brands make 800 million is not because of rich people. It's because now these brands, cater to the working class and cater to the middle class that are buying accessories, that are buying the different pieces, buying the footwear, buying those hideous McQueen sneakers, right? With the thick sole, buying, the t-shirts, buying the skull scarves. So their opinion is valid. And if you think that it's cyberbullying because they didn't like a collection, I think it does a disservice to fashion as a whole, to be honest. But anyway, continuing on. Rant over. Continuing on. It says, far too much of the Instagram commentary veered into cyberbullying, cloaked in the guise of fashion criticism. In the 90s, Lee McQueen was known to place gilded skeletons amid the press seats at his shows as a reminder of his disdain for their occasional reproaches. One wonders how he might have responded to a 290-part thread weighing in on his draping skills as McGirr had to endure. Can you imagine, he asked me at one point, sounding both amused and appalled, if I had Instagram? Interesting. On my way to Clerkenwell, I wondered whether McGirr might have become jaded since I last glimpsed him. Back in Paris's Chinatown in March, being pointedly asked by reporters what he thought Lee would make of his debut collection, but no. McGirr's pleasure in dressing, whether others or himself, remains intact. If it's become de rigueur for the millennial directors of major fashion houses to adopt a uniform of the Uniqlo crewneck Levi's 501's variety, McGirr still chooses a look every day for the sheer joy of it. Say skinny jeans from Capital in Tokyo, a vintage tweed blazer from Stefano Pilati's time at Saint Laurent, and diamond pave earrings from Antwerp's Diamond Twactier? Interesting. He says it's the place for a bit of bling. Interesting. He gushes, too, about the 2024 Met Gala when he and Lana Del Rey spent the previous night choreographing their red carpet moves in her suite at the Plaza, ordering M&M top sundaes for room service at 2 a.m. in a nod to Home Alone. It's very stressful, obviously, but I managed to have fun, McGirr says. That's important. Let's see. Yumu says she does not agree with me. What don't you agree with me about? It's fine to not agree with me, by the way. I don't believe that you not agreeing with me means that you're cyberbullying me. Okay, Amani says, and naming why is okay, but I think your comment is a bit disingenuous. That's interesting. What is disingenuous about my comment? I'm just curious. Mountains of tomes going on and on about conceptual art. There needs to be a bibliography with huge words to back up the catalogue. Yeah, this is also true, but I guess the magazines don't want to lose the advertising dollars. Well, they don't. Which is why you always have to bear in mind the motive, because magazine articles are always going to veer on the side of protecting the brands and protecting the designers, mainly because that's literally how they get paid. So they can't not do that, literally, financially. So you just have to be careful when you're reading. You have to bear that in mind. Someone said even his friends at Show Studio said the collection was bad. It's not bullying. I had a few comments above the one after that I don't agree with Io one in which I spoke to why I don't agree. Okay, cool. Let me see. Calling people names is in fact bullying. Calling people a stupid idiot or talentless is bullying. To be honest, I didn't see anyone calling him a stupid idiot personally. And obviously I would never do that. I don't speak like that. I don't use words like that. I wouldn't call, I've never said something like Seán McGirr is talentless because first of all, it's not true. The whole stupid idiot thing is just totally unnecessary. I personally did not see that. But anyway, I thought what I saw online was a lot of critique and people actually saying why they didn't like it, right? I made a video, I spoke about exactly why I didn't like it in depth. There's a Show Studio review where they spoke about how they didn't like it in depth. I don't think that, anything is bullying about that, to be honest. But if people are calling him a stupid idiot and saying he's talentless I wouldn't say is bullying. Stupid idiot is. Talentless is more like, okay, that's opinion. It's really harsh. I don't really still think that's bullying, but the stupid idiot thing is completely unnecessary. But anyway, continuing on in the article, this was really interesting because they talked about, McGirr and talking about Philip Tracy and all the interesting millinery and how they bonded at the Tracy studios, and Tracy reminding McGirr that McQueen spent much of his life being undermined, which is true because McQueen's early collections, people really didn't understand it. You think of, collections like Highland Word and people, it wasn't just that collection, to be honest. There are many collections where people were literally saying that Lee McQueen is a misogynist because people didn't really understand, his ideas. And that's true. That is true. Lee McQueen at one point, people didn't really take to his work. And I guess that happened with McGirr. And if he keeps on pushing, I've said myself, I think he has really improved since that first collection. And I was someone that was really critical of the first collection. Like the Spring Summer 25 collection, I actually love a lot of the collection. So, you're a designer at one of the storied houses. I think you just have to deal with it. That's my personal opinion. But going on, it says, now obviously Lee and Isabella are such heroes and they always are in their own right. But Philip told me that in the 90s, people didn't understand them. He was like, people hated Lee, says McGirr. Lee and Isabella were rebellious, but without being arrogant. That's important. McGirr is in no way arrogant, but he is resolute. As Jeffrey says, he's been charming, fun-loving, and jolly. But it would be a mistake to confuse his kindness with weakness. There's a kind of Celtic fire in him, Jeffrey adds. And if people turn around or say no, it's just well, I'll fucking show you. We love that, Seán McGirr. Show us. I love that. People didn't like your debut collection. You're like, I don't give a fuck. I will fucking show you guys. I love that. I love that spirit. And I also love that he has improved since then because it shows. It actually shows. So I love that spirit from Seán McGirr. I absolutely love that. I absolutely love that. In the years when Alexander McQueen reigned over Cool Britannia, McGirr was coming of age beside the Irish Sea in the Dublin neighbourhood of Bayside, a 60s suburb with a medieval Kilbarrack graveyard, with his bedroom walls lined with tickets from emo concerts. His mother, Eileen, a fertility nurse, can trace her eldest obsession with design back to the hours and hours he spent building amazing structures out of Legos as a 3-year-old. While his mechanic father, Brendan, remembers McGirr whiling away rainy Saturdays hanging around his Dublin garage. Now, obviously, this is really interesting because he has referenced his dad, especially in the first collection with those, structures that are inspired by the fact that his dad is a mechanic, which is very, very interesting. So yeah, I think it's very interesting in this collection. Sorry, in this part of the article, I said in this collection, they talk about kind of his background and his upbringing and how that has brought him to the time here. What I really want to skip to is the first time he saw the label Alexander McQueen. I think that's an interesting part to skip to. So it says, the first time McGirr saw the label Alexander McQueen was in the department store Brown Thomas on the soles of Lee's 2006 Puma collaboration. It's also around this time that his paternal grandmother, Maureen, a department store window dresser, gave him a 1950s sewing machine, and that he learnt about someone named Eddie Slimane, quickly deciding to snatch his school uniform to match Slimane's signature skinny Dior homme silhouettes. Today, you can feel the legacy of teenage Lee and Slimane fandom in McGirr's aesthetic, and in his muses, none of whom McQueen pays to wear its clothes, an abnormality in our transactional age. He's pleased that Beyoncé, among many others, was really, really obsessed with the voluminous shearling coats in his first collection, and that Charlie spent much of her brat summer in his hoof boots. She's really like the girl, actually, Charlie. But he's far more effusive when telling me about Florence Sinclair, a British Caribbean musician with 10,000 Instagram followers, and a sound that reminds him of Lou Reed. As for whether he plans to continue nurturing McQueen's affiliation with the Royals, yeah, they haven't reached out to me yet, he jokes, although he thinks the kids are quite cool, and that 6-year-old Prince Louis, one of 3, has the most McQueen energy. Interesting. McGirr lives in a 2-bedroom 60s apartment in the emotional nexus of London, where Soho revellers and Piccadilly tourists brush up against the toffs of St James's private men's clubs. He still does his own grocery shopping, still has his mother Maureen as his iPhone background, although he's delighted to now have the luxury of a spare room for when his family comes to visit, even if said spare room is largely filled with his collection of 80s Armani suits. I do love when designers have a collection of, archive clothing. I just think it's really interesting. And it's like cool because I know a lot of them reference their archives. A lot of designers do that, which is really, really cool. But it's so funny that they said he still does his own grocery shopping. I get what they're trying to do. We already know Seán McGirr grew up working class. He's not anymore in the sense that he's rich considering his role. He's on a high salary, but I get them trying to humanize him and really trying to push his working class though, which we understand. And I'll give him all the credit in the world for, overcoming all the barriers of being working class and making it to the top of fashion. That is really, really hard. But, the whole he does his grocery shopping. Seán McGirr is not a celebrity. So if Seán McGirr goes grocery shopping, no one is going to stampede him and he's going to be able to move around. So the whole, he does his grocery shopping. It's just funny that they mentioned that. It was so unnecessary to mention that, he does his own grocery shopping. He's just like one of us guys. I love that. He is, by his own admission, a bit of a workaholic. That's just what I like to do. Most days he's awake before 7 a.m, reviewing the voice notes he sent to himself the day before over a full pot of slow drip coffee before lifting weights or practicing yoga and heading to the office on foot. This is another, heading to the office on foot. He walks to the office. I'm very sure he doesn't live far from the office anyway. There's a touch of woo-woo to him. He's into Reiki, cold baths, and analysis. I don't know if everything in the whole world relates back to your relationship with your mother, he says. Though sex, he quickly adds, is really important. I find myself wondering whether any of this has proved a lifetime since last October. We're in a taxi now, speeding back towards the centre of London, past the gilt statue of Victoria Memorial and the Regency curve of Piccadilly Circus. I still myself to ask, as we approach his stop, How exactly has he coped with the trolls? His response is measured but moving. Obviously, I'm a human with a conscience, so if someone says something that's a bit mean, it might hurt my feelings, but at the same time, it's noise. You're going to have noise. We say our goodbyes, and he's swallowed by the ground traffic of Soho. The question, particularly for young designers, seems to be, can you still hear your own voice in spite of that noise? Now, we'll pause there. Critique is not noise, because absolutely just associating every single critique with it's just noise is what leads to designers being out of touch and not knowing what they're doing. I actually think that a lot of fashion designers, not just fashion designers, I think this is a case for fashion execs, a lot of people, the fact that they believe stuff like that, like any sort of critique is just noise, is a big reason why I have a job, because I see everything that happens. I get all the feedback from people, whether it's nice or not. So I'm very in touch with everything that's going on in fashion at a specific point in time. And a lot of times when I walk into the boardroom, a lot of these people, creative directors, execs, they're so out of touch with like fashion as it exists in the current day, which is why I say really basic things. And they're like, oh my God, I never thought about that. I don't think as a designer, you should see critique as noise. I think that there might be some things that you don't like, and there might be some things that maybe might be hurtful, but I think you should try and extract the validity out of it. Sometimes I get comments in my YouTube videos where people start by saying, you're a fucking idiot, you're this, you're that. But then what they say at the end of it is actually really valid. And it's actually like, oh, that's actually really good feedback. So I will take the good feedback, even though they started it with the very, you're an idiot. That's how they started it. So I think you have to be able to take the good with the bad and also see what's valid. I think just packaging everything into its noise is not good for your own personal development, in my personal opinion. So yeah, then they talk about really a lot of his ideas, because the journalist is talking about how, they came into the show and kind of everything that happened at the show, kind of what the inspiration points were and those kind of things. So it's really interesting. I just kind of wanted to talk about the article because he was talking about his idea of McQueen, and I think a lot of what he mentioned in this article will go unnoticed. I will say, as many of you can, try and read this article because I honestly think it's really, really good. I think a lot of interesting things were said. I think there's so much information if you want to learn about Seán McGirr as a person, Seán McGirr's ideas for McQueen, what his goal is for McQueen, what he sees the future of McQueen as under his tenure. So I think there's so many interesting things in there. And I just think that, in general, it's just like some really, really interesting points that were mentioned in the article overall. This YouTube channel runs on your support. If you want to support the channel, you can subscribe to my Patreon. You'll gain access to exclusive content that includes everything from my Patreon podcast, where I give a behind the scenes insight into the fashion industry, as well as a fashion book club where I review my favorite fashion books. You can also check out my fashion ebook, which highlights the best fashion journalists to follow, definitions of common fashion terminology, and how to determine what a good source of fashion information is. The links to everything are in the description below.